This next question is a very popular kind of question, though it isn't exactly asked this way. Here's the way the question is asked. I'll give you its more popular characterization in a moment. What method do you use to determine which laws from Leviticus are for today and which aren't? Now, the question is good in the sense that it assumes that some apply and some don't. The way it usually comes up is when Christians speak against homosexuality, which the Old Testament and the book of Leviticus speaks against it as well. And in citing that passage, naysayers then point to all kinds of other things in Leviticus that certainly we don't apply today, and therefore they simply assume then that none of the other prohibitions in Leviticus apply. Now this is, and sometimes they do it in kind of a snarky way. This is bad thinking, because Leviticus not only has a bunch of odd rules that we don't seem to take seriously now, and the prohibition of homosexuality, but it also has prohibition of kidnapping and of rape and theft and all kinds of other things too that clearly we'd see as immoral. So simply because some things in Leviticus seem to be inapplicable today and some do, that some don't seem to be inapplicable today, doesn't mean that none are inapplicable today. I didn't say that right, but I think you know what I mean. Just because some don't apply doesn't mean that none of them apply. Okay. So how do I answer the question? I have two answers, and one might shock you. Here's the first answer, and it's really the operative answer. What method do you use to determine which laws from Leviticus are for us today and which aren't? No laws in Leviticus are for us today in virtue of them being in Leviticus, because Leviticus is specifically a legal structure that governed the Jews under the theocracy. It was part of a unique contract God made with the nation of Israel to govern them. It was not meant to govern the rest of the world. It was meant to govern the Jews. And it no longer governs the Jews. So as a covenant, as a body of legal work, it applies to no one today, it seems to me. Now, before you freak out, let me make a comparison, because I'm not saying we can do anything we want in spite of the fact that it's prohibited in Leviticus. If you are living in the state of California, you are not under the laws of Vermont. There may be some similarities between the laws of California and the laws of Vermont, but you would never ask which laws of Vermont apply to me in California, because the answer is no laws in Vermont apply to you in California. And they say, what about the murder laws? The murder laws of Vermont don't apply to you as a Californian. The California murder laws apply to you. So it turns out that both states prohibit murder, but when you murder in California, you're not violating the Vermont law, you're violating California law. In a similar fashion, the laws that are given here in Leviticus are for the Jews. Some things are for the Jews under their unique set of circumstances and would never be repeated anywhere else. Just like you might have some laws in Vermont that apply to those in Vermont and have no relationship nor application, even in principle, to people in California, and so they don't show up in our laws. But other times you're going to have laws that reflect universal moral obligations and are going to show up in any state's law in virtue of that. And so the real question that we have to ask ourselves is, when we go back to the Mosaic Law, what do we learn from the Mosaic Law that might give us some understanding of what universal moral principles might be expressed in that law that would apply to us in virtue of being universal moral principles, not in virtue of being in the Mosaic Law? And so I think murder is wrong, not because it's prohibited in the Mosaic Law, which would include the Ten Commandments, but because murder is wrong and it's transcendent over all governments and applicable to all governments and all people, and therefore that's why it shows up in the Mosaic Law to begin with. So, basic principle, no laws in the book of Leviticus apply to us as such, simply because they're in there. What we have to do is we have to look and see, is there in this prohibition a reflection of a greater, more transcendent moral obligation that all human beings have before their Creator? Sometimes you can tell that by simply reflecting on the nature of the law itself. Other times you can tell that because of the way the prohibition is worded. Other times you might tell this by something that is said in the New Testament that affirms the deep morality of some principle in the Old Testament, in the law, that applies to anyone regardless if they're Jew or Gentile under that law. So I think that it's, on reflection, it's obvious that taking an innocent human life without proper justification, murder, is wrong in itself. And in fact, it's prohibited before the Mosaic Law in Genesis 9:6. Anyone who sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, because in the image of God, God created man. So there's a transcendent principle here. And you can go through them and see it like that. The one that's most in question, of course, is is homosexuality. But when you look at the prohibitions of homosexuality in Leviticus, first you notice that in Romans and other parts of the New Testament, we see that as well. And so we can see that this concern of God's transcends the covenant that he made with Israel. And the rationale in Romans 1 and the rationale in, say, Leviticus regarding this seem to be similar. In Leviticus, it says that if a man lies with a man as he lies with a woman, this is an abomination. So this is a stronger statement that God is making regarding this thing. And notice that it is descriptive of an unnatural state of affairs. We know from Genesis chapter 2 and 3 that God created woman for man, sexually, not man for man. And so there is this replacement thing going on that seems like it's not right. This is why the wording is that way in Leviticus. And when you read a good translation of Romans 1, where it talks about homosexuality, and I would suggest the New American Standard, you see something there that's similar. That men abandon the natural function of the woman and they burned in desire towards one another. In other words, God gave them woman for their sexual function, and man abandoned what God gave, who God gave, and they, in an unnatural way, that is unnatural regarding the intention of God, burned towards each other. And this is what's condemned there. So this also gives another hint as to how are we to understand those prohibitions in the Old Testament. So the three principles, I guess, is first you realize that just because it's in there doesn't mean it applies. It doesn't apply in virtue of being in Leviticus or the Mosaic Law. Secondly, the question is, does it reflect a transcendent moral concern of God's? And you know that by reflection, you know that by the wording of the law itself in the text, and you know that by possibly by affirmations that are made outside of the Mosaic Law in the New Testament about the transcendent moral aspects of that thing. And if you apply those principles, I think you'll do well.